Hello and welcome back to International Peace and Conflict Studies. In this online lecture, we're going to be looking at our module on environmental and resource conflict. So looking essentially at how areas of environmental issues, and particularly the increasing scarcity of global resources, might be a major source of international conflict right now and definitely going forward into the future. In this online lecture, we're going to begin by talking about why some of these resources have become increasingly scarce and some of the key environmental issues that are on the forefront that could potentially lead to conflict. And so here we're going to begin by looking at some sources of environmental damage and degradation, particularly around some of the human impacts that we've seen on the global environment that have led to increasingly scarce number of resources. Part of this is in practices, and part of this is just in the fact that there's many more human beings on the planet than there were before. Issues around some of the stresses caused by population growth. And here we're also going to talk a little bit about some of the broader global patterns that we've seen that are major threats to the environment around climate change and with the ozone layer. From there, we'll talk about some of the impacts that increasing environmental issues and scarcity have had. First, looking at potential interstate conflicts that are on the rise over resources. So these are conflicts between states. Beginning to look at so-called simple scarcity conflicts over vital resources like oil, water, or land and food. And then looking at the role increasingly played by environmental refugees as a major source of international tension. From there, we'll look at potential sources of conflict linked to environment and resource scarcity at the intrastate or internal level within states, and look at how some of these issues have either exacerbated some existing conflicts within states or might even be creating the potential for new conflicts within states themselves. And then last but not least, we will take a broader global look at international conflict linked to the environment and resource scarcity, looking at some of the growing tensions and divisions between the so-called global north of developed states and the global south made up of many of the developing states around the world. So to begin with a look at some of the key sources of environmental issues and particularly resource scarcity, one thing that we need to look at is some of these elements of environmental damage and degradation that's been caused as a result of some of the practices of over-extraction of the resources that we have. Just the very fact that people have been using up resources at an increasing rate, and also in ways in which many of these resources are not replaceable, or we're extracting resources in a way that's potentially very damaging in the long term to the global environment. And so what we've seen is a growing extraction of many of the resources that are considered vital to modern life, particularly in modern developed industrial societies. So access to things like fuel and energy resources, things like oil, coal, or natural gas, the things that we use to power industry, to power our cars, and also to heat our homes. The extraction of minerals, metals, and other resources, so things like iron, tin, copper, uranium, also precious metals or precious gems, things like diamonds, and so on and so forth, or even down to precious metals that are used in modern electronics, like in our iPhones, increasingly becoming extracted and increasingly scarce. And last but not least, one that's been around for quite some time, but the extraction and increasing scarcity of lumber and timber resources around the world as a result of major forestry practices. And the problem, of course, is when these resources, not just when these resources are extracted, but when they're over extracted or done so in ways that aren't sustainable in the long term. And so what we've seen particularly is as a result of some of these over extraction practices, we've seen damage and degradation to the environment, but we've also seen a lot of previously thought to be renewable resources become unrenewable resources. And this is particularly the case in terms of resources from plant and animal life that we've extracted. Because what we've seen as a result of some of the over extraction or unsustainable practices is that many of these natural species have now been rendered increasingly scarce because they've been endangered or are increasingly extinct or wiped out. And so we've seen this kind of extraction of plant and animal life, or the over extraction rather, in the form of things like unsustainable agricultural practices. So ways of farming or taking resources from the land in ways in which that land is then in the future rendered unable to support life. And this is what we can see in some of these very quick and damaging agricultural practices. Also, we could see this in patterns of overhunting or poaching of certain species that are supposed to be protected, again, rendering them endangered or extinct. But maybe one of the biggest major sources of issue around this in recent years has been around the overextraction of fishing resources or fishing and whaling resources, where we've actually seen as a result of some of the overextraction of this resource global fish stocks very, very much on the decline as increasingly more of these populations become endangered, extinct, or overexploited, and now so-called collapsed. And you can see some of these stats just on the bottom of the slide here, where you can see many of the fish stocks around the world have become fully or heavily exploited, overexploited, or now depleted. And very few of these are actually recovering in ways that are sustainable. So, as a net result, what we've seen is the global supply of things like fish stocks have actually been on the decline and are becoming increasingly scarce. And this has been something that's very much been on the rise since the 1950s and onwards, where we've seen increasingly kind of industrialized and technologically advanced sources of fishing leading to just catching more fish and harvesting more fish. And as a result, we've seen the collapse of a lot of fish species around the world. You can see from the second chart here, it's projected by 2015, the long-term trend is that a very, very high percentage of many of the fish species around the world might collapse or be depleted. And estimated already about a third of global fish stocks have already collapsed or been exploited by this point. And so again, the takeaway here is that a lot of these practices are unsustainable in the long term, and at least even in the short term, are having the net effect of making some of these resources increasingly scarce. We also see, as a result of some of the extraction of these resources, or maybe the refining of these resources, or the use of these resources in industry, that we are also seeing some environmental damage and degradation as a result of the pollution that comes out of some of these processes. So, this is pollution of the air, land, and water associated with industry, the extraction of this, or just broader patterns of human development. And so, what we've seen on the rise is increasing things like emissions or byproducts of these, chemical byproducts, the creation of toxic or nuclear waste, and also increasing patterns of smog. If many of you remember, this is kind of from the picture that's in the top right of the screen here. At the last Olympics that took place in China, they actually had to stop a lot of cars from entering into Chinese city centers because levels of smog in many of the urban Chinese cities where these events were taking place were so high that they were considered to be dangerous to the health of the athletes. But of course, this is also an issue in North America as well. As we know, pollutants and environmental damage and degradation were something that very much came to the fore when we had the BP oil disaster in recent years, where many, many tons of oil and other waste byproducts were released into the environment, and again, having a major knock on effect on not only damaging the environment but also on resource scarcity. And a lot of these problems that we're talking about here, particularly around the extraction of resources, the increased scarcity of resources, are something that it's projected are going to become even worse as the number of human beings on the planet grows. Estimated right now, we have about 7 billion people living on the planet today, which is already a huge growth just from the last 100 years. And looking forward to 2050, most of the projections set us at being on track to have 8 to 9 billion people on the planet. And what this means with more people is just there's going to be a much greater demand on those resources and a much greater potential level of a lot of the environmental damage and degradation that goes along with it in terms of pollution. And a lot of this, of course, associated with broader practices of industrialization. And so what we're seeing is a lot of the population growth that we're going to be seeing is estimated to be in developing nations around the world, where patterns of population growth in many of the more developed nations have largely stabilized. And these are also some of the greatest states in terms of their industrialization growth as well. So places like China and India, not only are we seeing huge spikes in their population, but also the fact that those countries are becoming increasingly industrialized and contributing again to some of those environmental damages associated with pollution. More broadly, what we're seeing as a result of some of these practices around resources and industrialization is some of these long term global trends that we're seeing around climate change and global warming. We now have a lot of scientific evidence to suggest that we are seeing a long term rise in overall world temperatures that seems, the science would seem to suggest, that are linked to the emission of greenhouse gases and other pollutants from modern industry and things like cars. That have been concentrating in the atmosphere and are helping to reflect back the energy of the sun, and as a result, bumping up global temperatures. And again, this has a lot of knock-on effects for environmental damage, but also for resources. One big thing that we're seeing as a result of this is a major threat to biodiversity and ecosystems around the world. The fact that we're seeing rising global temperatures, there's a lot of plant and animal species that simply aren't adapted to live in those temperature ranges. So we see kind of the archetypal examples of as a result of polar ice increasingly melting as a result of these larger temperatures, major threats to the habitats of polar bears, for instance, and some of their hunting and fishing patterns around the world. But we are also seeing a lot of threats, not just to plant and animal species, but also to human beings as well. As a result of increasing global temperatures and polar ice melting, we're also seeing and projecting to see rising sea levels. And so this can lead to widespread flooding, particularly on low lying coastal areas, or potentially have the long term threat of maybe even wiping out some smaller island nations that are at low sea levels. We're also seeing a lot of science suggesting that global warming might be leading to patterns of weather disruption. So, rising temperatures, but also an increase in natural disasters, things like hurricanes and tornadoes, but also more broadly patterns of drought and flood. And of course, this having a major impact not just on human beings living in these areas, but also on access to arable lands and crops that rely on relatively stable water patterns. Also, we haven't heard as much about this recently, but still is definitely a broader global trend that we've seen is these patterns of ozone depletion that are also linked to some of these industrial pollutants that have been released into the air, and essentially breaking down the ozone layer over the planet and letting in more ultraviolet rays than we'd ever seen before. And this has had some major damage on agriculture and the access to arable land, but again is also impacting those plant and animal species that we use as resources as well because they aren't simply adapted to live with this kind of exposure. And you can see, unfortunately, a lot of these patterns of environmental damage, degradation, and potentially the growth in things like carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions that are projected to be leading potentially to climate change and global warming are actually on the rise around the world. And here we have a chart just looking at the 1990s projected up to the 2030s. And we've seen a major, slow, steady increase in many countries in terms of the billions of tons. Here we see the United States kind of slowly been on the up and up and up and projected to keep going up into the future. But a lot of these emissions are going to be, many would say, coming from many of these industrialized or industrializing countries in the developing world with increasing populations. Places like China, which has had a major economic growth and also a major population growth, has now, as of 2015, actually surpassed the United States as one of the world's biggest polluters, particularly of these potentially very dangerous carbon dioxide emissions. So, what does all this mean? Again, we see broader patterns of environmental damage and degradation, and as a result of this, increasing levels of resource scarcity, access to these renewable and non renewable resources overall around the world. And what this has many international relations scholars worried is there a potential that this could lead to increasing conflict? And unfortunately, we've seen already from the case study evidence that this is indeed the case. And one of these areas that it's projected that we might see greater levels of conflict is at the level of interstate conflict or conflict between states. And a lot of these centered around gaining access to some of these increasingly scarce resources. Conflict that we have seen at the level of interstate violence is the so called rise of simple scarcity conflicts, which are linked to increasing patterns of competition over some of these key or vital resources that are increasingly shrinking. Here, in particular, we're thinking about resources that are deemed to be vital to national security or are essential to the well being of states, or particularly modern industrialized states that want to maintain the current standard of living that they have. So, this includes things like oil, something that Michael Clare focused a lot on during our New Geography of Conflict reading that we did back on interstate conflict, and also is brought up in our documentary this week on blood and oil. But also access to things like land, particularly arable lands, these shrinking stocks of minerals and other non renewable resources, and also things like timber. But maybe one of the areas that has people most concerned is access to fresh water resources, something that we often think of as a renewable resource, but has increasingly been on the decline in terms of who has access to this. Estimated that over 80 countries around the world in 2015 don't have sufficient access to fresh water resources. And also, many people around the world certainly are living in conditions where they don't have access to at least clean and fresh water resources or have insufficient access to it as well. And this is an issue that's increasingly on the rise. And also, of course, because water is perhaps the most essential resource that we need just to sustain basic human life. And so, obviously, is something that every state around the world has an interest in making sure that its population has access to, and is definitely a vital interest to their national security. So many scholars, including Gleek this week, have looked at how we could see potentially a rise of so-called water wars between states around the world who are trying to get access to these increasing, dwindling supplies of water. And the real issue seems to come to the fore when a lot of these resources aren't just increasingly becoming scarce, but uh, also when these are combined with areas or issues when the control over these resources is shared or contested between two or more states around the world. And unfortunately, we have lots and lots of current and contemporary case studies to look at where we've seen this become a major, major issue. One, again, that's taken up in our documentary this week is looking at the US's interest in securing sufficient oil reserves to sustain its own economy and also sustain its own military. And has this potentially led to the US to engage in interstate conflicts? And as we see in our documentary in Blood and Oil, potentially conflicts in the Middle East, which has traditionally been a very, very oil rich region of the world. Also, something that Gleek takes up is the potential for water wars are, of course, exacerbated when we have rivers, lakes, or aquifers. Those areas are sources of fresh water that are shared or contested between many different states. And in many cases, this is the case. And so we see things like the Nile Delta, for instance, shared between different states. Also, when we're talking about access to land and oil, another source of contemporary conflicts has been around the South China Sea, where China in particular and Japan have both claimed access or ownership over the South China Sea and some of the particular islands within the South China Sea that would give them potential access to some vast oil reserves that are in that area as well. And a major, major source of recent tension between these countries. We also see potential for simple scarcity conflicts over the Arctic seaways, as we've seen receding levels of polar ice, particularly in the north. This has increasingly become attractive to a lot of northern states who have increased tensions with one another over who might have access to new waterways that would open up in the north, or potentially new resources that would be tied to ownership of some of the land in the north. And so we've seen countries like Canada or Russia, Norway, and others have very much come to tensions and direct conflict with one another over who might have access to Arctic seaways, something that's still being debated today. And last but not least, kind of a funny aside, we've actually seen patterns of simple scarcity conflict played out between states who you might not expect. Again, one example of this is the so-called Turbot War of 1994 to 1996 between Canada and Spain. And this was over who would have access to some of the fishing waters and fishing rights off the east coast of Canada. Canada claimed them for their own. Many other states declared that they were in international waters and should be fished by anyone. And we actually saw a relatively tense showdown between those titans, Canada and Spain, who had access to these waters, leading to actually the Canadian Coast Guard arresting the crews of a couple of Spanish fishing trawlers and creating some kind of major diplomatic incidents between those two countries. Aside from the potential for these conflicts over simple scarcity, over who would gain access to some of these vital resources, we're also seeing the potential for interstate conflicts over some other broad patterns that we're seeing resulting from environmental degradation and damage, and also scarce resources, in terms of the growing number of so-called environmental refugees that have emerged around the world. And so these are people that have fled their homelands, sometimes as a result of a major natural disaster, potentially linked to climate change, maybe major droughts, floodings, famines, and so on and so forth. Or maybe even as a result of unsustainable environmental practices like the over extraction or unsustainable agricultural practices that have rendered former lands that once were arable no longer usable for crops. And so people have moved on to other areas where they hope that they can build a new life and gain access to these resources. And this is, of course, we're seeing growing levels of environmental refugees because a lot of the issues that lead to the creation of environmental refugees have only been compounded in recent years by these patterns of that we've talked about, patterns of population growth, increasing degradation, environmental change, and increasingly scarce access to some of these resources. And the danger, of course, for interstate conflict is this can lead to tensions, particularly when we have environmental refugees fleeing across borders into other countries. Oftentimes, this can create a major issue for that host country. It creates a major stress on their own resources, who now have to look after refugees in addition to their own populations, and they might not already have enough resources just to go around for the people in their own country. So that can create some major problems for that country. It can create tensions between countries, between illegal migration between different states, and also it could lead potentially, and we've seen this in a number of cases, to the rise of xenophobic violence between people in one country against environmental refugees that have joined there, out of fear that they might be taking food or other resources out of the mouths of that local population. And aside from interstate conflict, though, we also see the potential for environmental damage, degradation, or resource scarcity to also contribute to intrastate conflicts or conflicts within states. And again, this goes back to this growing stress that might be on the diminished resource pie that's in a lot of these different countries. And so this refers to the fact that there might just simply not be enough resources to go around within a country that everybody is going to have the access that they want to these resources. And this is something that's compounded by the presence of inequalities in how these resources tend to be distributed within a society. And so we see the presence oftentimes of inequalities between who gets access to certain resources and who doesn't, sometimes between economic or class groups in a society, sometimes between different political groups in a society, sometimes between regional groups in a society. Here in the cartoon that we have down in the right-hand corner, it's a cartoon going back to North and South Sudan, now separate countries, but at one time had some major tensions even internally between these regions over who would have access to some of Sudan's vast oil reserves. Alternately, we might see tensions between urban and rural groups, or last but not least, tensions between inequalities in access to resources between ethnic and national groups. And so what we see is that resources and the lack of access to resources is something that can either exacerbate some of the existing tensions that might already exist between these groups and societies, or might actually even create new sources of conflict between some of these different groups within a society. And these are often tied to the sense of maybe real deprivation between one of these groups who maybe don't have access to enough of these resources to maybe meet their basic human needs, who might not have enough access, for instance, to food and water within a country. That's definitely something that could lead to conflict. Or even so-called relative deprivation, where maybe one of these groups and societies feels that they're not getting what they're owed in terms of their access to some of these resources. They're not getting a fair slice of that diminished resource pie. And the danger, of course, is not only that this could lead to conflict itself, but this could actually be incredibly damaging for some of the states where this goes on. And there's been a lot of work that's been done that looks at how this could actually lead to increased fragility or a weakness of a state, because oftentimes we have governments who are facing increasing demands on resources, again because resources have become increasingly scarce, or maybe because population levels have risen within their own countries, but who simply just don't have the capacity to be able to satisfy all those demands, and particularly all the demands between the different groups living within their own countries. And so this can lead to real challenges to governments and challenges to states, where we see rising levels of discontent, maybe civil strife, or even the potential for outright violence between some of these groups against the state and against one another. And so here we could have the possibility for things like rebel groups, guerrilla groups, or coups against the government that are led largely by some of these grievances linked to real or relative sense of deprivation of access to some of these resources. And again, the danger here is this can lead to state fragmentation. So maybe a government loses control over the state, or the state breaks up into some of these constituent elements, and this can lead to the creation of so-called failed states, where the government has essentially lost control over the country. Or, on the other hand, and this is something that's mentioned a little bit by Homer Dixon, on the alternate side, we might have governments who react by cracking down even harder on their own populations to put down these challenges to themselves. So we could actually see a rise of increased authoritarianism within government, so the creation of these so-called hard regimes as a result of interstate conflict. But more broadly, beyond just international conflict and interstate conflict, there are also global tensions that many scholars have looked at that are related to environmental damage and degradation, or increasing resource scarcity. And so what we've seen is the rise of tensions between these developed states of the global north and the developing states of the global south. And some of these tensions surround the fact that the majority of the global resources right now are being used by some of these wealthiest developed states of the global north. And these states also tend to be one of the main sources of environmental degradation and pollution as well. And a lot of these kind of modern industrial societies with very high standards of living tend to be some of the main polluters as well, and also some of the countries that use most of the world's resources. On the other hand, we have these developing states of the global south that are those countries that are likely to be the ones worse impacted by the effects of things like climate change or resource scarcity, are also potentially the most prone to interstate or internal conflict. But again, these are also societies, because of the fact that they tend to be much poorer, have a lot less resources at their disposal, that tend to have the least societal or technical capacity to kind of respond or adapt to some of these potential challenges. So some of these states in the global south are in a double bind in some ways. But also we see, as we've already mentioned, a lot of these states in the global south are potentially going to be some of the key challengers when it comes forth in terms of environmental damage and degradation, because it's the global south, again, that is one of the major sources of global population stresses. It's also going to be, as many of these societies industrialize, going to be become a major source of growing resource demands, also going to be one of the major sources of environmental refugees, and again, overall, this future environmental degradation and damage. Essentially, as these societies grow in number in terms of population, and as that population becomes increasingly industrialized, these are going to be many of the countries around the world that are going to take over as some of the main uh, drawers of global resources and also some of the main sources of degradation and pollution of the environment. So, this does set the stage for some real tension between the global north and south. And so here, again, many scholars have said, is there going to be maybe the potential for conflict or definitely increased tension between these different countries around the world, between the developed North and the developing South, over this dwindling amount of scarce resources, and also some major conflicts and tensions over how the future of the environment and some of these environmental impacts might be best managed and dealt with. And so the potential problem here is that we do have what some scholars have referred to as a bit of a catch-22, where we know that to deal with a lot of these issues of environmental damage and degradation, to deal with a lot of these issues around resource scarcity, it's something that is going to involve all the countries around the world. It's going to involve a coordinated effort between the global north and the global south. But of course, these are the very same forces that are increasing the potential for tension between the North and South and make it less likely that they might be able to get together in terms of cooperation and negotiating, coming up with things like international laws and treaties about how to deal with these issues. So, again, what we're left with, and this is very much the state that we have in 2015, is that it seems that the global environment and increasingly scarce resources could be a potential growing source of international conflict, both between states and within states. But we don't really have a good solution. There's a lot of these tensions, particularly tensions between the North and South, that seem to be preventing us from coming forward with viable solutions towards cooperation and negotiation that might lead to a solution to some of these problems. So that's it for the online lecture component of this module. Now that you've finished up this, what you can do is then turn to watch our Blood and Oil documentary. Again, a documentary that's based on some of Michael Clare's work, looking at the U.S. interest in foreign oil and the potential that this has had for leading towards interstate conflict between the U.S. and other countries, particularly countries in the Middle East. After the documentary, you can turn to completing our required readings for this module. There's two readings from Homer Dixon. One's from 1991 and one's 1994. And I would suggest that you read those in order just because I think they will make a lot more sense that way. After you finish those, there's the reading from Gleek that looks at the possibility of these potential water wars moving forward, so international conflicts linked to water. Also, if you can, you might want to go and review your notes previously from Michael Clare's The New Geography of Conflict. I think that'll be really helpful for our discussion here. But again, this is just a recommended reading and isn't one that's required, but again, might prove helpful. Once you finish up your readings, you can post in our online threaded discussions, which will be open over the course of the module. And then last but not least, if you are signed up for this module to write your response paper, remember these are due Sunday on or before 11:59 p.m. And they're supposed to be submitted to YO courses as either a PDF or a doc. And just to be clear, these response papers should be responding to the two readings from Homer Dixon and Gleek. The Clare reading that I've recommended isn't something you need to include in your summaries or analysis, but again, you are very welcome to bring in Clare in your analysis if you think that it might be helpful in these response papers. All right, that's all for now. I'll look forward to hearing your guys' thoughts in our online threaded discussions.